Hey there, welcome into Unpaid Interns. It is Wednesday afternoon, February 24th. I'm Griffin Epstein. Thanks for joining us for a midweek episode, and we have a really exciting guest on today. Super excited to bring on Paola Boivin. Paula, it's a laundry list of accomplishments for her. She's a longtime now retired columnist and journalist for the Arizona Republic. She was inducted recently into the Arizona Sports Hall of Fame, the first female journalist to join that prestigious group. Currently a professor at the Cronkite School of Journalism, teaching sports journalism, and she's also a member of the College Football Playoff Committee. Paula, I know you're busy with all those responsibilities, but really appreciate you coming on today.
My pleasure, Griffin, and that's kind of a big build-up, calling me exciting and all that. I'll do my best to keep it interesting.
Well, I wanted to start with your career because it's really interesting. And I was wondering if you could just kind of take us through your career path from how you started, got into sports journalism, and all the way to through the Arizona Republic.
Sure. So, I think when I was young, I never gravitated toward what I think my mom wanted me to. She used to buy me, Barbies, and I would put like eye black under them. I just was not interested. I was interested in sports. And so from the time I entered high school, I knew I wanted to write sports for my high school paper, and I did that. And, the other part of the equation was just growing up. My dad was a big White Sox fan, and, he was one of those guys that worked 9 to 5, took the train into Chicago every day. He would come home kind of cranky. But man, when we went to a White Sox game, he was like a different person. And so I remember thinking, I want to be around this kind of a career somehow. So it was sort of the love of writing and the love of sports that got me in this career path. So I went to another fine Big Ten institution, Illinois, go Illini, and I wrote for the student newspaper there. When I got out, like a lot of journalists, for the first couple of years, couldn't find a job. So I packed up my bags and moved to Beverly Hills, literally with a friend of mine. We found jobs in a long distance phone service. But after about 2 years, my career started. I worked at a little paper in California called the Camarillo Daily News. Went on to the Los Angeles Daily News. Also did some sports talk radio at the time. From there, I went to the Arizona Republic in Phoenix and spent most of my career there as a beat writer and columnist. And then about 3 years ago, I made that transition to teaching. A little bit burnt out of travel, and so I made that change.
It's a long, interesting journey. So many accomplishments along the way. And I know with the Arizona Republic, you spent a lot of your time as a columnist, as you said. I'm curious, what's the difference kind of in the process of being a general reporter than being a columnist?
Yeah, that's a great question, Griffin. And it was honestly, a hard adjustment at first to me, because you got to kind of put yourself out there. There are a couple of different ways to do a column. You can be sort of scream in your face, Stephen A. Smith version of a columnist, where I hate this, I love this, he should be fired. Or you can be a columnist that maybe tells deeper, richer stories, finds angles and stories you haven't found before. And so that's sort of what I eventually morphed into. I think when I first got a columnist position, and I did a little bit of that in LA, I tried to be the kind of talk radio person, and it just wasn't my personality. And so I would wake up in the morning looking at a column I wrote and like just not feeling good about it, because I didn't really feel like I was being myself. And so I just really wanted to tell deeper stories about people, maybe things that traditionally you wouldn't cover as a beat writer. And that's the direction I did. I mean, I could get righteous when I needed to get righteous, but it usually wasn't about hirings and firings as much as it was about social injustice, racial injustice, inequality with female athletes. Those kind of things would get me riled up. So I would go that route with those kind of topics, but really tried to write more about people and tell their stories.
You mentioned you're kind of trying to tell people's stories, and I know you kind of like the underdog story, whether that's literally in sports or kind of just in life. Is there maybe a specific story that you worked on and highlighted someone that stands out?
Oh gosh, there's a million great stories in sports, and you're right. I mean, every sports story has a villain, has a good underdog. I think one of my favorite stories to write, and I don't know if it's like the traditional underdog, but I had the opportunity to really follow the Arizona Cardinals the year they went to the Super Bowl. And there is no better underdog than Kurt Warner as a quarterback. I mean, used to work at a grocery store, who was out of football for several years, who, this is a guy in college or just out of college, met his wife at a country music club. Met her. She had kids. One was a child with special needs because the father of this child had dropped this poor baby in a bathtub, and so he entered this marriage of this really challenging situation. I remember him telling me he had a car. They were so poor, he had a car that would only turn left. So they always had to plan their trips to the grocery store and everywhere so that they can only turn left. So anyway, I just thought his story was phenomenal, and we kind of see what happened in his career, St. Louis and other places. And so when he came to the Cardinals, I don't know if people were expecting quite as much as he delivered. And to follow his story, to follow that magical year when they ended up in the Super Bowl and he got them to the Super Bowl and they almost won the Super Bowl, that for me was really fun. And a lot of that is because Kurt is really his own person. I'm not a super religious person, but one thing that Kurt does is he's honest about himself, and he would talk about, this is who I am. And he would talk about God, and people were, sports writers are often afraid to quote religious things. I was always certainly one of them, but he never backed away from it because it's what he was. So my long-winded answer to your question, I think, is just the opportunity to cover someone like that and to see them succeed at that high level was really, really fun.
Another thing I'm curious about is your time at the Arizona Republic. You worked there for such a long time, 20 years, and so many big athletes and big time sports in the area. And I remember when I had an opportunity to go to Cronkite and take your camp, and we went to Arizona Cardinals, summer training, I guess. And we got to go and talk to Larry Fitzgerald just because you had mentioned you had texted him earlier that day and asked him to come over, which just blew my mind because it's Larry Fitzgerald. What's kind of the relationship that you build up with athletes over your time, especially when you're a market so long? And how do you kind of, especially as a columnist, have to balance, being fair with their performance and also trying to build a relationship kind of as a source?
Such a great question. And that part is so hard. And I will be honest, for many years in my career, I failed at it because, especially as a woman in this business, I never wanted to be my intentions misinterpreted, because when I was in the business early on, there weren't a lot of women. And so there was always some, and it was especially outside sources, readers or whatever, who would accuse you of wanting to enter a locker room for, the wrong reasons, which is so ridiculous. Because if anyone's been in like a hockey locker room, they're the most disgusting things ever, right? The smell, it's not like it's this charged atmosphere. But so early on in my career, I never really was able to master that relationship because I was uncomfortable with it. As I got older, what I realized is if you are honest in what you write and you are transparent in what you write, and even if it's negative, you might get an athlete or a coach to yell at you, or they might yell at you at some point. But if you sort of show up the next day and are accurate in your reporting, that stuff blows over, and there is a level of respect. And certainly with Larry is such a different kind of cat. When I would cover the Cardinals, he got to know who the writers were and their names. And I'm sure some of that was just, he's a good person and a nice guy, but it also, I think it helps you if you're nice to reporters in some way, shape, or form as an athlete. But he was always so generous with his time that I felt comfortable doing that. I don't know if there are a lot of athletes that I had that level of comfort with who would share their numbers, but if you're around a team enough, and that's really the key, I think, in journalism, to be around, for them to get to know you and for them to trust you and get to know your intentions. It's really hard when you just drop in to suddenly have these relationships. So I think the advantage of being older was that I'd been around enough. So
Now, you mentioned the challenges of being a female sports journalist. So when you entered the industry, I can't imagine there was too many other females working in sports journalism. What were the challenges of this over the course of your career?
So initially, I think it was just, I mean, it was just such a novelty. There weren't many. I mean, I think of Melissa Ludke, who is such an important name in sports journalism, because she had to sue the New York Yankees basically to let her cover the World Series. I mean, that's how bad it was. Excuse me, sued them to let her into the locker room to cover the World Series. So that's what it was like early on. I was kind of that next generation of female reporters that came in, and I would say 95% of the athletes and teams I dealt with were great and were professional. And but I think one of my biggest memories was I was working at one of my first full-time jobs was this little newspaper in California called the Camarillo Daily News, and they had assigned me a story to go to a LA Dodgers game and go to the visiting clubhouse and interview Terry Pendleton, who was great player for the Cardinals, who was from the area that I worked. And I had never been to a baseball clubhouse before. And so I mean, it's anyone, even writers now who cover baseball will tell you it's kind of a weird atmosphere. You're kind of intruding in the space of athletes. In baseball, you're allowed to hang out in the clubhouse often for an hour or so before a game. And so I walked into this clubhouse. I'd never been in one before, and within like 10 seconds I felt something land on my shoulder, and it was a jock strap, and unfortunately it just stuck to my shirt. So then a Cardinals player, who to this day I don't know who it was, just got in my face and said, "Are you here to interview somebody or to look at a bunch of guys?" and said a not such nice word. And so I turned around, walked out. I was about to quit. I remember thinking, this is not something I want to deal with. Fortunately, a really nice fellow journalist came out, brought Pendleton out. He did a great interview, and it was fine. But I didn't have many of those moments, but there were enough of them. And the positive side of that story is just years later, I was covering the Dodgers for an LA paper, and I was in the Dodgers clubhouse, and I heard this psst, psst, and I look over, and it's Orel Hershiser, who's a former pitching great for the Dodgers, who you may now see on ESPN. He does a lot of broadcasts, especially for Little League World Series, and he was calling me over, and I'm thinking, what is this all about? And he told me, he goes, "Paula, I see you walk into this clubhouse every day, and you're always staring at your feet, and your shoulders are slumped," which, by the way, was absolutely true, because I did everything I could not to be noticed. He said, "Next time you come in here, I want you to have your shoulders back, your head up, and walk in here like you belong." And that like changed my mentality. I guess I just needed to hear someone say you're being supported. I think for a lot of women early on in their careers in sports, especially at that time, you suffer from something called the imposter syndrome, where you really, enough people telling you don't belong, you start wondering if you do. So that was a really positive moment. So from there on, I didn't have a whole lot. I think in Arizona, it was a little rocky at first when I started there, but then people realize your intentions and things like that. So it's better. I mean, it certainly got better for me. We've seen in the last couple of months some professional sports executives getting fired for how they've been treating some female sports journalists, which to me is just appalling. It's still happening in this day and age, but I think it's gotten a lot better, no question.
What progress do you feel like, continues need to be made, and what can we do as a society and as media members to continue improving that, so those appalling incidents that you mentioned, completely go away and women are fully supported when working in sports?
Griffin, I think one is to get continued support from their male colleagues. I know that sounds so obvious and simplistic, but back in the day, we didn't hear much of that. I think now we do, and it's been great to see things on social media. But I think in incidents, even like in a clubhouse, locker room, field, if something like that happens, having a male colleague step up and say something could go a long way. I think we still need to get more women in executive positions in sports. I mean, if you look at statistics, there's a ton of women like leaving, sports journalism schools, like here at Cronkite at ASU or in Indiana, um, aspiring to do great things, but we find like 10 years later they're out and of the career, and that's disappointing to me. And I think part of it is we're not putting enough women in higher positions to sort of help navigate the sometimes difficult terrain. So I think a lot of it has to do with hiring practices and things like that.
Well, I want to switch subjects a little bit. That was really interesting to hear from you. And another one of your many accomplishments in 2018, you were named to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. Now spent 3 years getting to decide who gets to play in the playoff every year. I'm just curious, what was the process like being able to join the committee? What was your reaction to being able to now being really one of the most 16 powerful people in college football, you could put it?
It's crazy, and some days I still can't believe it. The process was I received a phone call from Bill Hancock. He's the head of the college football committee, and he invited me. I know it sounds so simple, but I had known Bill a bit in my past from all my years covering sports journalism and in sports journalism, covering things like the Olympics and things like that. And they had recently started adding a former media member to the panel. So I was the second one that they had selected. And I don't know why. I guess my many years in sports and my absolute love of college football had them select me. And it's been, just the coolest experience of my life. I'm about to start my fourth and final term, and it makes me sad to think it might be over soon. But yeah, when he called me, I was at home. In fact, he called me at home, and I didn't even return the call for a few days because I thought, uh-oh, did I write something, that he found that he was going to give me a hard time about or something? And so I called him back a couple days later, and he mentioned it to me, and I about spit out my orange juice I was drinking. I couldn't believe it. So it's been great.
It's been really cool to see you there. I'm curious, obviously last year was a really unique year for college football and sports in general. What were maybe the differences and the challenges for last year in 2020 compared to the first 2 years working on the committee?
Oh, I think, just the challenges that everybody else faced. We were meeting in masks and we were meeting socially distanced situations. A lot of it didn't change because the reality is most of our work is done leading up to those weeks. I mean, we watch an unbelievable amount of games, especially at the beginning as we're still sort of figuring it out. And then as we get closer, so that part never changed. I was still doing that at home. I think the biggest changes were just when we would meet in person, and it was very safe, and we were all tested beforehand, and it was socially distanced, but it was just weird because there's such a great kind of camaraderie that is involved in these meetings because you're like, spending lots of hours together. And so that a little bit of that was removed because of how it was set up, but it still, I think, worked just fine.
In terms of the actual analyzing of teams, and there weren't a lot of non-conference games, teams played different numbers of games. Was that in a way maybe more challenging, just to when you're ranking teams 1 to 25 and one team's played 10 games, one's played 5 games?
So yeah, I mean, I think and Bill Hancock has talked about this, and as hard as you're going to get me to talk about Indiana, Griffin, I won't. We don't talk specifics. I could see it. But I think he's just said in general, and I would agree, we went into this knowing it was going to be more challenging because there was an unequal amount of games and things like that. But they decided they wanted to power through with the way we had done it in the past, and I was fully supportive of it. So it presented unique challenges, but I felt really, really content at the end of the season that we did the right thing.
I won't ask specifically about Indiana, though. I know everyone here wants me to. There's still definitely some simmering anger over some of the decisions. I am just curious because I think, especially this year, and in part due to the unusual circumstances, there was a lot of criticism from media and from fans of the committee. How much do you guys hear that? Do you ever discuss it, or do you kind of just block it out? And I'm wondering, as a journalist, sometimes you get that criticism too. Is that maybe a little similar?
Well, I can tell you as a a woman who has been in sports journalism for 30 years or whatever, criticism doesn't bother me one bit. I mean, I've heard it my whole career, the whole "you don't belong" thing. So really, when I would get some feedback, and people find me a lot through social media because I'm active on social media and I love social media. It didn't bother me because the reality is people are just passionate about their teams, and it sounds so cheesy, but that's sort of what I love about college football. The passion, these are teams at either a school you went to or they're in your neighborhood and you love them or your family loved them. So I totally got it. Were they always right in what they were saying? Not necessarily, but that was okay. That's just part of it. And we hear it. It does not impact our decision making at all. I mean, this committee is as much about integrity, and I'm not just giving you a cheesy line because I'm a journalist and I wouldn't lie about it, but there is nothing evil going on in that room. It is just people discussing football and trying to make the best decisions.
Last question on the committee. I'm just curious of kind of the day-to-day process of starting from the beginning of the season of week 1 to when you're meeting and on that last day and selecting Final Four. I mean, what is that process, especially early in the season? I know you're not together. How much communication is there between the committee?
There is. So one of the great things we have, in addition to all the football that we watch on TV, is I have an iPad that I can load any game on there, and it has the coach's cut, so I can go through any game pretty quickly. So the communication early on is just, hey, these are the games that are going to be available. Here's the schedule. Things like that. But really those first few months of the season are just about us watching, and, it gives us some context as we get to October and November, what these teams look like. So it is really, most of the communication is somewhat minimal, other than, these are the games, let's pay attention to this, things like that. And then just watching football a lot, which, it could be worse things I have to do in my life than watch 100 games of football a week or whatever.
How many games around on average are you watching every Saturday?
Oh gosh, I've never sat down to think. Early on, it's a ton, because it's still unknown of who it is. As it gets closer to our top 25, you can narrow the field a bit for sure. But anybody that seems relevant, I watch. Some you go through a little faster than others, but that's what my weekends are, and I will take breaks. Sometimes I'm here at Cronkite, 8 to 5 every day, and I'll sometimes spend my lunch and my evenings watching too. So,
well, I know Indiana fans are going to really be hoping that you're going to be watching a lot of the Hoosiers this fall. I'll leave it at that.
I can say with 100% certainty, I will be watching a lot of Indiana football. I promise.
All right. Well, I wanted to transition to your current job as you're working at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State. And I'm just curious, you're working over 20 years in Arizona as a sports reporter and columnist. What made you want to get into teaching?
I think as I've looked back on it now, I think that was really always my passion I had when I was young. I loved even when I was younger, I loved sort of being around students. I loved being around kids. And I knew that might be something down the road. I did. While I was at Arizona, I would teach a class over at Cronkite, a sports journalism reporting class. And I wouldn't get paid. I told them to not pay me because I was also covering ASU sports at the time, and I thought there could be a conflict of interest. So I did it for free. But it was my way of sort of seeing if I loved it. And those last few years of my career at Arizona, at the Arizona Republic, I realized how much I loved teaching and that opportunity. And my gosh, your generation of students right now just fire me up, just because of I'm learning so much from things about, some of the big debates we're having in journalism right now, or even about objectivity and what really defines objectivity. Does, for example, putting Black Lives Matter in your Twitter bio make you less objective if you're going to cover a police rally? Those kind of deep questions have made me think. And so I love your generation of young journalists, and I love teaching. And I think I was also a little bit burnt out of journalism by the time I left. I had been traveling a lot. I had all these great opportunities, and just felt like this would be a great new sort of rewarding experience. And it has been tenfold.
Especially that you're now teaching a lot of the next generation of sports journalists and sports media members. I've asked a lot of media members that have come on this, especially with the pandemic. Things are changing across the world, including with journalism. What do you kind of see as the future and things that are going to change in sports journalism over the next years?
I'm so curious. But I will tell you one thing. I know some people are like, is journalism dying? Is newspapers dying? No, it just evolves. Just like our iPhones change every year or whatever. Journalism's just going to look different. I think there's going to be more of, with newspapers, subscription type models, as we've already seen. I think that could continue. But I think one of the best things I've seen in recent years is the success of the Athletic sports publication, because, we were kind of getting in this era where people are like, people can't read more than 140 characters, and they're not going to read a deep, thoughtful story, when the reality is publications like The Athletic or The Undefeated, which I love, sites like that, they're deep, thoughtful writing, and there's a hunger for that kind of writing, and that to me is exciting. So I think we're changing, but in some ways we're kind of going back to what's important in sports journalism, and that really excites me. And then, broadcast wise, obviously streaming, things like that is sort of changing how we watch our games and second screen experiences and all that. But I'm excited. I think the journalism changes a lot, and I'm always excited to see where it's going.
You kind of mentioned the deeper feature stories, and we touched on this a little bit earlier about your kind of love for going in depth. What makes a strong story where you can really, in a couple thousands of words and really bring out a story that maybe isn't, otherwise out in the open?
I mean, the key, just because, especially in this journalism environment where there's so many types of platforms to report stories, is the ability to tell people something new. And that can be challenging sometimes. But I think when you do a deeper story, you have the opportunity to do that. And you have that opportunity because you talk to more than 2 people. Maybe you talk to 8, and maybe you only use 5 or 6 of those interviews. But the ability to tell people something new, and maybe also tell them something that'll make them think in a different way. I think those are all sort of great ways to tell a good, deep, rich story. And, people are so interesting. Boy, that sounds like such a dumb, broad statement. But I remember years ago, there used to be this columnist in a small town, and I can't remember what town it was, just a general news columnist. And he used to pick up a phone book. If you guys know what those even are, open it, close his eyes, put his finger on a page, and whoever's name he landed on, he would go in the small town, find this person, and find out their story. And the reality is everybody had one, whether it was, somebody who was an Army veteran who had a deep, rich history, to someone who was a successful athlete they never knew about, to someone who was battling a tough disease. Everybody has a story. And I think that's absolutely true in the sports world. And so I think that's probably why I've always enjoyed sports journalism so much.
That's a fun activity, just to point in a phone book and find a random
Great.
person.
I'd love to try that.
Doing that these days, but great idea.
I would love to do that sometime too. I thought that was a great idea.
Just a couple more questions for you. You've already kind of given us some specific advice. Obviously, you teach classes and give students at the Cronkite School all loads of advice and tips. What's just the general advice for especially current college students right now if they want to go into sports journalism or sports media?
Well, a couple things. Come to Cronkite. No, I'm kidding. That is one of many good, like Indiana, a terrific journalism school. But also go in with the mind frame of being accurate and being truthful. There is, and I'm sure you guys talk a lot about this too, there is such a desire to be first, to pass judgment. Gosh, I was thinking about everything with Tiger Woods yesterday and some of the things I was seeing on social media about rush to judgment and things like that. To just keep the tenet of important journalism in your heart of being accurate and being fair. because ultimately that's going to carry the excuse me, I'm having trouble talking. The length of your career will extend longer if you're able to keep that in mind versus, being the person that breaks the story first.
It's definitely great advice. All right, last question for you, a little bit of a fun one. I was talking before about I'm thankful the weather's getting a little better here in the Midwest. No, not much of an issue in Phoenix, but I knew you grew up in the Midwest, grew up in Chicago, went to school at Illinois. What do you miss most about the Midwest now living on the West Coast?
Oh gosh, a couple things. I miss, and I love Arizona, but man, the snow, I miss those seasons like around Christmas. It's just, hanging an ornament on a palm tree doesn't quite have that same Christmassy holiday feel or whatever, that sort of the holiday season. I think the weather I missed there. In Chicago, I missed there were just neighborhoods with the sort of great ethnicity to them of, they had a Little Italy in Chicago, all these great different kind of communities. Just because Phoenix is newer, it doesn't quite have that. I loved that part of going down to Chicago and experiencing different lifestyles, different cultures. And I missed going to Illinois football games. That was a lot of fun.
Well, they're not there. We'll see how they do this coming fall. And a little up and down for the program recently.
Yes, for sure.
Paola, we really appreciate you coming on today. Really fascinating stuff. And best of luck in your last year on the College Football Playoff Committee. Fingers crossed. It's a little bit more of a normal year, a little bit easier work for you guys.
Appreciate it. It was great to talk to you again, Griffin. Thanks for having me on.
That will do it for today's episode of Unpaid Interns. Of course, if you missed any of today's episode, you can check it out on the IU Sports Media YouTube page or Twitter page. And if you prefer to listen to any of our episodes, you can always listen to them wherever you get your podcasts, including on Sprecher. We'll be back for our final episode of the week on Friday. We're going to be talking a little bit of college basketball with March Madness right around the corner. Iman Brennan, who's a college basketball writer for The Athletic, will join me at 11 a.m. Eastern time on Friday. So we hope you can join us then on the IU Sports Media YouTube page. Until then, for Paola Boivin, I'm Griffin Epstein. Thanks so much for watching. Take care, everyone.